Here with David Whiteside, Director of Performance Science with the New York Yankees. I reached out last year after you and Coach Lawson's I-70 presentation, and so I've been excited for this for about 12 months. So, David, thanks for jumping on with me.
Oh, I appreciate it, and I appreciate you waiting until a more convenient time of year for me. As you can imagine, it's pretty hectic during the year, but this is a perfect time. So I know it's been a long time coming, but I'm super excited to be here.
And this is perfect timing for the release because it'll release in January. So it's great because it kind of gets everybody going. And so we have a wide range of coaches that listen in from pros on down to youth. So everybody's getting going. So there might be some things that we talk about that some coaches can implement, or maybe, keep in the back of their mind for maybe the fall. But I'm excited about this because your guys' presentation was tremendous. You guys speak my language on that stuff, and I love that you guys are trying to drive the game forward.
No, I appreciate it.
Talk about your path a little bit for anybody that doesn't know who you are.
Yeah, it's probably maybe a little bit less conventional than your typical guest. As you can obviously tell, I'm not from this country. I'm from Australia originally. I grew up playing sport. It's kind of part of the culture in Australia. You play cricket in the summer and then Australian rules football in the winter. My parents are actually from Northern Ireland, so I actually grew up playing soccer. My dad moved to Australia to play soccer, so I was always around soccer. I played it all the way through to grad school. And I'd almost still say that it's my primary sport. It's still my sport of choice, oddly enough, even though I work in baseball. So sport was always a big part of my life. I always had a desire to kind of be around sport in some capacity. So I went to college and I did, I guess, what the equivalent here would be of a kinesiology degree. So kind of around like exercise science, movement science, those kind of pieces. And that's where I first got exposed to biomechanics. And at the end of my degree, I didn't really know where I could kind of go at that point, probably like most of us did at that point. So I kind of just stumbled into a PhD with our national governing tennis body, Tennis Australia, and that focused on biomechanics and skill acquisition. And it was a really tremendous experience working, with elite tennis players at all levels of the development spectrum. So my PhD focused on the best 11-year-olds in the country, the best, 15-year-olds, as well as our senior girls who are on tour playing Grand Slams. So I finished that up in 2012, and at that point, I'd been in Australia for 25 years. I'd been at the same institution the whole way through, and I kind of just wanted to spread my wings. I didn't want to get pigeonholed into different categories. I wanted to see different systems, different people, just different exposure to different things out there. So I was lucky enough to get a postdoc at the University of Michigan, and I spent 2 years in Ann Arbor, and I had the opportunity to do exactly what I wanted. I worked across sports like baseball, ice hockey, softball, sports that, again, don't really exist in Australia. Not to mention the college sport experience in itself. High school and college sports don't really exist in Australia. If you play sport, you're typically playing private. So to walk into the big house, Notre Dame, 113,000 people, I'm like, what the hell is going on? This is ridiculous.
Hey, what years were you at Michigan?
2013 and 2014 were the years that I was there. And that was the first years where I got exposed to baseball. So we started doing some work. Eric Bakich, who's still head coach there, was head coach at the time, and Sean Kenny was the pitching coach. He's now at Georgia. And we were doing, you want to talk about forward thinkers in baseball, by the way, those two. We're talking 2013 now. We're doing full body motion capture in the practice facility. We got high speed cameras, front, side, back, release. We got markers on the ball doing spin axes. Fall of 2013. So those two guys were ahead of the game, put it on record. So we did that, and I also had a buddy who was doing a PhD. He was a huge Cubs fan, and honestly, strange as it sounds, I'm 25, 26 years old. This is the first person I've ever met who's a fan of baseball. So he kind of got me into things. He exposed me to the PitchFX database, which is a public source database with all the velo, the spin rates, and me, who's coming from this life sciences research background where it takes an hour and a half to set up a session, 2 hours to do the session. You got to process the data. You got to find participants. I'm like, this is convenient. I've got like 2 million pictures here. Everything's already done. I can just process it. So I did some research with that big league database. After 2 years, so 2014 comes, 2 Michigan winters were enough for my wife. So we had to move back to Australia. I was sports scientist there. And fast forward to 2016, some of those research publications in baseball I talked about were now coming out in the literature. And there was kind of a little bit of, public traction around them, I guess. This random job pops up. Didn't actually say what team. It was a Major League Baseball biomechanics job. I wasn't interested initially. Then I kind of did a little bit more research, and I kind of got the sense it was the Yankees. And if it wasn't the Yankees, I actually don't think that I probably would have thought about it, just because I didn't know much about baseball. But the one thing I did know was that the Yankees were pretty big time. Um, so I applied. It was one of those ones where you kind of reach points in your career where it's now or never. I had that public traction around it. Everything was topical. Baseball was moving in a very technological direction. Um, so I kind of decided, hey, well, let's give it a shot. Your former teammate, John Kramer, was director of performance science at the time. So he brought me over, went through the interview process, and he was nice enough to give me a shot. And I guess the rest is history. Now I'm on an ABCA podcast a couple of years later.
Hey, I want to back up. When you were working with tennis, what were you finding working with the elite of the elite at the different age ranges? Was there much difference besides physiology and maturation, or were some other things that sticking out, some common bonds maybe between the elite with the different age groups?
Yeah, the one thing that sticks out to me always is basically what I guess I'd say mentality. It's their approach to practice. And look, it's one thing to be an elite 11-year-old. Not all of those, players often have that mentality. But the one thing I will say, it's a case study, but it's an important study nonetheless. So we worked with, there was girls like Sam Stosur, who was number 4 in the world at the time. She just won the US Open, actually. She beat Serena. We're talking 2011. Um, at the same time, there was another girl, Ashley Barty, who was 14, 15 at the time. And she's actually the number 1 player in the world now. So she's been number 1 for the last 2 years. So that's very interesting being able to look back there, because I only knew her as a 15, 14-year-old at that time. She really stuck out to me from a mentality standpoint. Like, there was a clear separator in what she did, how she went about her business, how she put everything into preparation and practice, and just there was no fanfare around what she did. She came to practice, she gave you 100% every time. She went home, she came back the next day, rinse and repeat, right? There was also an element of her, which I think is a really important attribute in all athletes, of not focusing on the negatives. She could have a bad match, she could have a bad practice session, but the next day it was like it didn't exist. She'd moved on immediately. I think that served her well. If you look at her now, she won Wimbledon this year. If you look at her trajectory, it's something that still holds true now. I don't know how trainable that is. I think that's more of a question for the mental conditioning coaches, but
I
it's
think the
such an
elite
important
of the
attribute.
elite do that. They can flush bad performances, and that's across all levels. I don't care if it's athletes, rock musicians, actors, business people. You're gonna get knocked down sometimes, and I think their ability to bounce back makes them elite over the general population.
Totally. And the great thing about that, Ryan, is that's one thing that's controllable. You can't control your physical maturation or maturity or where you're at or how your peers are performing, but you can control that one thing. And I actually remember it was a quote that Phil Jackson gave about Michael Jordan that always stuck with me. It was at a point where I think Phil had kind of moved on to the Lakers, and he was with Shaq and Kobe. And a reporter asked him one day, like, hey, what was the thing that stuck out with you about Michael that kind of sets him apart? He said, the difference between Michael and anyone else I ever worked with is that Michael never had a form slump in his entire career. He's like, he could literally shoot 5 for 25 one night, 16 points, lose a game, and the next night come out and like drop 47 at Madison Square Garden. It's insanity. Um, for me, again, that was one thing that always stuck out to me, of kids who you didn't know they would make it, but you knew that they were different, and maybe that was going to give them a better chance.
And the wiring's different, and that's, as we evolve in sports and human and evolution, where you can get a better picture of what's going on inside. There's some really fascinating stuff going on with brain development, and I think that's the thing. Especially with baseball, you have all different sizes, shapes, abilities, but I think when you get in there and actually look at their brains, I think you're going to see a lot of similarities between what's going on with the wiring in there.
Yeah, totally. Yep.
What has your work with skill acquisition taught you? And I mean, you come into the Yankees with a fresh set of eyes. What were maybe some of the questions? And obviously, you worked with baseball at Michigan, and you could even back up to that. What were some of the questions maybe you were asking with your first look at baseball?
They weren't related to skill acquisition at all, if I'm being honest. They were more related to my wheelhouse at the time, which was kind of biomechanics. So it was in and around motion capture pieces. Um, Probably my seminal piece was actually in and around Tommy John injury and what some of the predictors of that were. Obviously, there's a lot of value in that in Major League Baseball, so that's kind of why there was some traction. And then
Hey, what were your
again,
biggest predictors?
there was a variety of them. I think most of them are well documented. Things like velocity, things like workload are critical. Maybe the things that I brought to it that hadn't been talked about before was just the importance of maybe rest and recovery in between outings. Um, Not necessarily something that we can always control, but I think to the extent we can control that workload outside the game, it clearly seemingly has some relation to injury. So it's something to be attuned to. And then this does actually, to tie into skill acquisition, that work was maybe some of the first to talk about how variability in performance, so not literally doing the same thing every day, was potentially protective against injury. Because if you think about straining a ligament, there's a hypothesis, the variable loading hypothesis. If you strain the ligament or stress the ligament in the exact same fashion over and over again, kind of makes sense, not rocket science, that it might break. Whereas having some kind of variation around that actually serves to protect that ligament over time. So a lot of it's well documented now, but it was an interesting data set to have 2 million pictures, like I said, to actually look at.
Hey, when you say rest and recovery, because when somebody's listening, they're going to hear rest and recovery, active recovery, correct? It's not completely shut down. What are maybe some ways to change up the training or the throwing pieces to keep people healthy?
Yeah, that's kind of shifting now, that whole paradigm, right? That shutdown piece was always kind of something that was just considered gold standard, or something we always did, which for some guys works, by the way. I think if you have a veteran player who's been in a routine for 10 years and has something that works for him, I think it's a little bit audacious for someone, even myself, who might have a background in this, to come in and say, hey, that's not the way to do it. Um, but now it's shifting toward just remaining active kind of year round, because the real challenge for us is, Ryan, it comes in and around spring training, whereby you have this kind of pretty quick ramp up. You're trying to get a guy to a point on opening day where he can throw 100 pitches in 6 weeks. Like, no other sport in the world is able to ramp up. That's just like a math problem almost. So it's about trying to just maintain some activity in and around the kind of off season, so that ramp up isn't as aggressive, and maybe protects you a little bit in that regard.
I mean, what can baseball coaches learn from other sports besides that? I mean, and I'm a soccer fan too. I played soccer all the way through, so soccer was my first love as a sport. I loved soccer much more than baseball growing up. But I mean, what can baseball coaches maybe take away from some of the other sports and what they're doing that baseball's not doing?
There's so many things. I do think, to get back to what you originally saw with that presentation Dylan and I gave, that there is a lot of ground to be made up in this skill acquisition space. I think the way that we design practice, there's potentially higher ground for us to reach there. And it's not necessarily that we're bad at it. I think there's a lot of things that we're good at. Just for whatever reason, though, I think maybe the constraints that other sports have lend them to being a little bit more explorative in this particular domain. So I don't know, like, I always look at BP as the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest thing to kind of hit on. Um, and I have to be careful, because I don't like coming in here and saying, like, I think BP is a waste of time, because that's not true. In fact, I think it has considerable value. I'd say it actually has the most value at both ends of the development spectrum. I think if you're a young kid first coming in to baseball, and you want to have positive experiences and kind of understand what it is to hit a baseball, I do think that kind of, what I'd term maybe monotonous or block practice, becomes important. Equally at the big league level, where if you're an all-star, there's only so much improvements that you can have, right? So it is really more about getting into a routine and getting ready for games.
And that's
It's
the
the in
comfort
between.
piece, and you talk about block training because, Ron Washington, he's got the Atlanta Braves middle infielders, their infielders out there doing block training. They're doing kids camp stuff. But again, is that more of a comfort and a routine piece, not probably a skill acquisition piece? It's more like that's what they're used to. And you see it maybe with chefs, mise en place, you see elite of the elite. They have certain things that they do for their routine to get them to be at their best when the lights are on. So that's more of a routine comfort thing than it is a skill acquisition piece.
It is, which is important. Like
Yes.
it is important, especially if it's been part of your routine for a while. Again, just from a mindset, just from a confidence piece, there's relevance to that. Okay, there's value to it. Um, the thing that comes to me when you start getting into the skill act realm is, if you break down BP as we did in that presentation, and you look at the elements that you're trying to develop. To hit a baseball is the most difficult, skill in sport, right? There's perceptual elements involved. You have to have nice mechanics. You have to be able to intercept the ball. You have to be able to create bat speed. Well, if you break down an actual pitch versus a BP pitch, time to plate is really good. We've figured that out. If you throw 50 miles an hour from 45 feet, hey, we're money. That time to plate is perfect. So the timing element's perfect. We're good. It's everything else. The velocity is obviously different. The spin rate's way off. The approach angle of the baseball is different, which obviously is going to influence your swing plane. So now you're changing the mechanics potentially. Even things like the tempo. Average tempo of a pitch in game is 18 seconds. In BP, it's 7 seconds. So you want to talk about guys who are trying to refine their mental approach in the box, stepping out, adjusting their glove, just trying to get in the right mindset. You're basically feeding them rapid fire, which doesn't give them that opportunity. Location, obviously, everything's down the middle, so that notion of swing decisions isn't necessarily there. Better ball quality is probably your first red flag. In BP, everyone's crushing balls into the outfield. Like, is that what happens in a game? No. Well, maybe the question becomes why. So if you want to talk about other sports, I think probably that notion of scrimmaging is something that I see a lot more in soccers, the baseballs of the world. Our pitchers and hitters seem to basically practice in separation or isolation more often than I would have expected walking in. And if you want to really go into that, look at something like the NFL. I mean, they literally employ practice squads, and the practice squads are designed and we're playing the Cowboys this week. We're going to set up our offense in the same way the Cowboys do. You're even going to wear the Cowboys uniforms with the same numbers of the Cowboys players on because we want to be that precise about preparation. So batting practice, like I said.
Hey, let me ask you, because in the old days, the BP pitchers used to throw from the mound back in the old days. But I think about that too. If you have a practice pitcher that can replicate big league stuff, they probably should be in a big league uniform competing, correct? But do we get to that point where we hire somebody, or you hire 8 or 9 maybe guys that just got released to throw pregame, but again, are the grounds guys going to let you throw off the mound too? Like there's some of those variables, but is there a way to make it? And we actually switched our BP rounds because we would do some feel good situational stuff for half. The other half of the time was our BP guy was actually trying to get them out, and it was a ball put in play or they swung and missed for a strikeout. They would play an actual at bat, and then next guy would come in to add in, okay, what you're talking about, the time in between pitches, making it more game related. And we felt like we got quite a bit of carryover to the game when we started to do that because they were able to flush some at bats out before they went and competed.
I love it. That's a perfect example. Like you can still have that feel good element with a progression to something more complex. And hey, it doesn't even need to be every day or every time you're having BP. It's just mixing it in along the way to mix it up. If nothing else, you're kind of changing up the monotony as well as maybe providing some more practice. So to answer your question, I actually think that we do end up moving toward more of that model. I think that some teams have already began to dabble in that. If you look at Japan, they actually carry anywhere from 7 to 9 BP pitches as it is. Now, again, to your point, those guys aren't throwing big league quality stuff because if they were, they'd be in the rotation. But they are throwing certainly more variations where they're certainly throwing from the mound or closer to the mound. They're providing cues that are more, serviceable to the hitter through the development process. I do see us. I don't know when it's going to be, and you know what baseball's like. Usually, someone basically breaks to the glass ceiling, and everyone follows immediately. Yes. I don't know who it's going to be, but I do think we'd probably land somewhere closer to that.
Hey, how does cricket handle it? I mean, I think there's some similarities between cricket batters and baseball batters. I mean, how does cricket handle their training piece with that to make it more game related?
So they have cages in the same way we have cages, and maybe there's a safety element to this, but you literally have bowlers bowling in game-like fashion in the cages. So there literally is a pace bowler. He comes in, he runs up, and he bowls from the crease. He's literally just replicating what he does in a game. Yeah. There is some stuff used with ball machines, don't get me wrong, and Pro Batter was used. It's kind of fallen away now, but it was used at the time. It just comes down to, again, that proportion of this, Ryan. Like, it doesn't need to be all the time. It doesn't need to be never. It's about finding some balance in between. They just provide more of this portion to the game-like stuff, and they do the kind of basic pieces that I'd say I'd put into that traditional BP category. And I do think it's important to note traditional BP, because it isn't fair to say that BP looks like that traditional piece everywhere. I think there's a lot of coaches out there who, even if you're throwing from 50 feet, are still mixing it up. They're still throwing it out of the zone now and again. They're still, mixing in a breaking ball just to keep guys on their toes and to keep that decision-making element critical and central to their development process.
Is there maybe an age development piece to this? At what age is this okay to fire away early? And I mean, we all played wiffle ball growing up. Like we had this when we were kids. Is just you're trying to get each other out. So we had this piece. I think about that too. Maybe with baseball, cricket, tennis. I mean, the bat is maybe a little heavier. I don't know how the bat compares to the cricket bat that they're using from a weight standpoint. Is that a warm up piece? For me, tennis, it's an extremely light racket. So we can kind of get out there and start firing away a little bit with the tennis racket, but I might be off on that as well.
I think honestly, we're going down another rabbit hole here, which actually still fits perfectly into the skill acquisition space. Let's focus on what you just talked about for a second, the notion of scaling equipment. And this is something that other sports do far better than us. Um, if you want to talk, let's just talk very, very generally to begin with. If we want to go back to the theory dictates that any movement, so motor skill or mechanics, they emerge from three categories, right? They can be influenced by the individual, so how tall you are, how strong you are, whatever. The environment, so whether you're playing at night or at altitude, can dictate how you perform. And then finally, the task. So, are you playing on a little league field? Are you playing on a big league field? Obviously, those things can also dictate it. Well, the equipment is the task. If I give you a 60-ounce baseball bat, your swing is going to be very different from if I give you a 32-ounce baseball bat, right? So if we look at our counterparts there, something like the ITF, International Tennis Federation, they've done a lot of research in and around how to scale equipment and courts and balls specifically to maximize the efficacy of player development. So if you have a 10-year-old, like you said, it is a lighter racket. From a 10-year-old in a relative sense, it still can be heavy if they're maybe underdeveloped. Maybe they're a little bit behind their peers, right? So you might need to adjust the court size they play on and maybe give them a lower compression ball that doesn't move as quickly off the court or bounce as high. By doing so, you're giving them opportunities to still remain in the game, get shots in, focus on their mechanics that they otherwise wouldn't have if we kind of progressed too quickly. Same thing is true. FIFA has their small-sided games model, whereby instead of playing on a large field where you got to run around and maybe get to touch the ball 3 times in 30 minutes, let's keep it compact. Let's get guys understanding how to basically control the ball in small spaces, get a lot of touches, familiarity with it. I think we do a nice job of that. And the last thing I'll say, if you want to talk specifically about baseball, the thing that's always struck me as strange in this regard, I was at an orthopedic conference a couple of years ago, and we were talking about weighted balls. And obviously, in the sports medicine space, weighted balls are kind of viewed generally in a negative sense, maybe because they don't view us as using them in the most appropriate way, I guess. We have a 5-ounce ball, obviously, that's regulation. The thing is, it's regulation in the big leagues and it's regulation in the little leagues. If you have a little leaguer who's 100 pounds who's throwing a 5-ounce ball, and that's the same as CC Sabathia who's throwing a 5-ounce ball, I hate to tell you, but in a relative sense, that kid is throwing a weighted ball off the mound as part of his competition every day. And it's something that we probably don't talk about enough. And if you want to talk about it as an injury piece, which is fine, I mean, I'm happy to have that conversation. You can't tell me, hey, don't throw weighted balls, but then turn around and be like, oh, little league, that's no problem. Like, it's either a problem for everyone, it's a problem for nothing. So
And every other sport, their ball is modified. Every other sport. You can go volleyball, basketball. Every other sport has a modified ball for their youth.
Totally. And let's think about this again from a skill X standpoint. Like, if you have a 10-year-old with hands who obviously aren't mature yet, and you're trying to maybe think about getting particular grips on pitches, two-seam work, does four-seam work, maybe we're going to start missing a breaking ball. It's effectively like Garrett Cole trying to, spin off curveballs with a softball. It's impossible. So in some ways, I'd argue if you're going down that road, like, how valuable is that in the long run? Because those mechanics that might work for him as a 10-year-old, as he develops and becomes stronger and has to change his mechanics anyway, you're going to effectively have to relearn how to throw that pitch anyway. So I do think there's a lot more higher ground that can be reached there. And if I want to go really tinfoil hat on this one, we talk about driveline as one of our Probably the biggest impetus for this maybe scientific kind of transition is technology and feedback and that kind of piece. I think that there's scope there for someone who wants to do this in this particular space. If someone were to create a facility or league that was built around skill acquisition with scaled equipment and focused more on basically doing that perfectly for a 10-year-old and progressing people relative to their biological age and maybe putting kids into different groups based on their progressive or their physical progression. We know that by doing that, kids can begin refining mechanics earlier because now they're basically using equipment and mechanics that will work as an adult, as opposed to working out things that maybe work as a 10-year-old, but hey, when I get stronger and faster, my mechanics change and I'm on a bigger pitch, and then I've just again got to relearn it. Now I've got to relearn it at 16. Now I've got to relearn it at 21 when I've had a growth spurt. Like something is there's something to be said to that, and I don't know if it's possible who's going to do it, but I do think that there's a revolution potentially in there somewhere.
And even playing like 6-on-6. I mean, scale the fields back, put two outfielders out there. I mean, I think you can modify some of the early on stuff so there's more action for them, and you see it now. And talking to Devin Morgan quite a bit at Driveline, you see the knockoff when the field gets bigger. That's where you lose participants with baseball because the field's now bigger. And again, they're having to relearn all those skills, and you don't get some of that same instant feedback that you used to get with the lighter bats, with the smaller fields. And that's where you start to see a lot of kids start to quit baseball because once they move to the bigger field.
Totally. I feel like you could argue that's maybe the more important thing than all of this. I obviously come from this from a high performance standpoint. We're trying to create big leaguers, but maybe the bigger thing for baseball is that it's the participation piece.
Yes.
Getting buy-in. It's about getting kids on the field. There's no better way to do that than to maximize their experience, make it fun for them, and try and give them success. Giving them a 32-ounce bat at 10 years old probably isn't the best way to do that. So just something to think about.
The other piece of the I-70 presentation was going into the military and how specific their training pieces are. And I know that goes into some of the practice planning stuff as well. I mean, what are some of the other things from the military that we can learn from a training specificity standpoint?
Okay, so this is something that I try and look to the leaders in different fields to kind of pull in. Hey, I know that everything doesn't work, but there's typically pieces you can pull out and nuggets from other fields. The military is obviously one that's closer to home because they deal in the same field I do around human performance. They're trying to optimize soldiers to do the best job they can in the field. They're also fortunate in the sense that they're well resourced, better resourced than any franchise on the planet. And there's also probably less regulation. There's a little bit more leeway to do whatever they want because they're trying to basically win wars effectively. So in that presentation, I talked about skill acquisition using a particular analogy related to Operation Neptune Spear, which was the...
It was fascinating. I loved it.
Yeah, I'll take your viewers who didn't see it through this as quickly as I possibly can, but Operation Neptune Spear was obviously the operation where they went to get and kill bin Laden, right? So there was a lot of background work. There's actually 10 years of intel, obviously, that went into that. There's actually more if you want to go back to 97 and the bombings in Africa. But obviously 9/11 happened. They tracked him. After much intel, they found his courier, who was living at this compound in Abbottabad that we all now know. They were getting a ton of intel on that compound. They'd rented houses around. They had the drones. They were getting everything they could. And they reached a point where they knew this pacer was on the third floor. They suspected that it could be bin Laden, so they made the call, okay, we want to go in there and do this. Admiral McRaven was I think he was the commander of the Joint Special Operations at that point. So in essence, I'd say that he was the head coach. So he was tasked with, you're going to put together your lineup for this, and you're going to be responsible for prepping these guys for this mission. And I think that what he did was probably the best exercise in preparation for anything maybe that I've ever seen. So he got his 4 elite SEAL teams to prep for this. They went to Harvey Point in North Carolina, and with all the intel they had in and around that compound, this is actually well documented. I'm sure most people know this part. They built a 1-to-1 scale compound at Harvey Point, and they did it in like a month, which gets back to my resources piece. The thing about that is that when I say scale compound, I mean scale compound. Like we're talking same height walls, same entry points, same walkways, the courtyards there, the guest yards there. They planted a vegetable garden. Like everything is one to one here when you talk about specificity or representativeness. So what that meant was that when they ran these missions during those 10 to 14 days of that prep in North Carolina, the SEAL teams were descending onto the same roof they were going to see that night. The snipers were setting up at the same, points to get, hey, this is what the vantage point will be here at different times of night and day and whatnot. The ground teams were breaching the actual doors that they would be hitting and seeing that night. So by their accounts, they ran like 500 missions during or practice missions during that 10 14 day period. But it was precise. Now that's the well documented part. The crazier part to me is what happened after that, which fewer people know about. So they spend that period in North Carolina. Then they proceed to fly to Nevada.
Yes, they went to Nevada next.
Okay, so lo and behold, they get to Nevada, and another one-to-one scale replica of this compound has been built in the Nevada mountains. And you might think, well, what the hell did they do that for? You literally just said they did 500 missions in 14 days in a one-to-one scale replica in North Carolina. Like, what additional value does this provide? And for me, this is taking this notion of specificity or representative design to the next level. They chose the location in Nevada because it had virtually the same latitude as Abbottabad in Pakistan, which means the temperature is very similar. Sunrise and sunset is the same. It has comparable terrain. The moon is even casting the same shadows at different points of the night, which means from a navigation standpoint, you're also kind of locking into different routines and things you're looking for. The altitude's also identical. So the SEALs and the choppers are being forced to kind of run these missions in low oxygen saturation, which is obviously really important for human performance. They also have this new stealth chopper, which remember had never actually been flown in a mission before. So they're getting, time with the controls and handling of those aircraft. They're practicing refueling under the cover of darkness because they know they're going to have to do that on the Pakistani border that night. Even the flight time, they made a point to replicate the flight time in Nevada that they would see when they got to the Middle East. So the flight time from Jalalabad, their base, to Abbottabad, the compound, was 90 minutes. They did that every night. And Admiral McRaven was adamant that by doing so, he was giving guys an opportunity to kind of hone into their routine. Some guys like to listen to music. Some guys like to do progressive muscular relaxation, whatever. Whatever works for you, figure it out and use this opportunity to experiment, but lock into something because this is what you're going to be doing that night. So every night they're on these flights. Even things as simple as like there was an assault dog, Cairo, Belgian Malinois. He'd never been in this chopper before. Well, the last thing you want is some vibration setting off an assault dog that night. So they're literally giving the dog reps in the chopper with the flight time that night. You want to talk about attention to detail, like there's nothing better than this. They obviously did this. They did the mission. And by the way, the mission, the last thing I'll say.
But that's the thing is they got one piece wrong, right? Like the fencing wasn't right. So the helicopter crashed, right? Because the fencing wasn't right.
100%. So yeah, maybe that's the most amazing part of this whole story. So as you can imagine, any military mission comes with a debrief. They're trying to figure out what went right, what went wrong. They want to take lessons out of it, which in and of itself, I think, is a pretty cool learning experience for all of us, right? But this was arguably the most important mission in US military history. So you can imagine the scrutiny around this. The SEALs were spent days in isolation going through everything. So they put the report together, and one of the key findings that they had was that the preparation wasn't specific enough. Imagine that after everything I just said, which is preposterous, they came back and said, actually, we weren't good enough. And the reason was when they went to Nevada and they built the one-to-one compound there, they were basically constrained for time, so they used chain link fences rather than solid walls. So obviously when they had the choppers in Nevada, the airflow through a chain link fence is very different to a wall. So they were basically setting up, this is how we're going to repel, this is going to be the point that we're going to set up. They got to Pakistan, that airflow hit the wall and basically came back into the chopper. They got caught in their own upwash, and he had to kind of do that controlled landing that we thought about. But again, you want to talk about the difference between preparation. For them to go through all that and say, actually, we still weren't good enough. Like, that's the difference between the best in the world, the best in history, and kind of what all sports are looking at. So
And I love the after action review from the military piece. I think anybody can, if you're running any organization, the after action review piece is the most important part from a learning standpoint and being able to get better as you go. Because if you don't do that, you're not going to be able to make those tiny adjustments to improve as you go.
That's just feedback, right? I mean, which again is another critical component of skill acquisition. There's three tenets around feedback. The first is that it has to be integral to performance improvement. There's no point reviewing things that are kind of irrelevant. What was the dog three miles away barking about? That's irrelevant. Well, why did the chopper crash? That's the priority. Um, the athlete you're giving this feedback to has to be capable of modifying whatever you're giving them feedback about. Don't give them feedback about stuff they can't change. It doesn't help the process. And then finally, whatever you're using to measure or get that feedback has to be valid. So you don't want to be giving them spurious information that might be leading them down the wrong path. There's also pieces about timing. So something that's interesting here is obviously you can only give feedback after performance. There's a reason that the military basically isolates those guys, say 1-2 days after that mission. You're trying to get as much information as quickly as possible. The same thing's true for us, right? Our timing of feedback needs to be quick. The caveat being here, and this is something that I think baseball could maybe learn, even something as simple as a velocity board, which a lot of us use now, right? You throw a pitch, velocity pops up. You can be too quick with feedback, which is something that a lot of people don't think about. If you're too quick with feedback, the athlete doesn't have enough time to basically reflect on what that performance just was, maybe look inward, what did I feel? They're focused immediately on the board and they lose that. Even as something as simple as putting the velocity board behind the mound actually allows the athlete, okay, I throw my pitch, I at least have, a couple of seconds to gather myself, I turn around, I see what the velocity was, and I put those two pieces together. Basically, we know that this notion of feedback is central to development. And I think that most clubs and facilities and even teams at high school level now know this. But without feedback, Ryan, as you know, it becomes really just a guessing game in many
It's a
ways.
waste of time, basically. Hey, how can a coach develop patience? I mean, I think our first instinct is to want to jump in there and help. How can a coach develop a little bit more patience to let the players figure things out for themselves?
That's really tough, and that is really level dependent because now you're getting into this guided discovery concept, which I'd say is a little bit contentious. I think most people have heard this notion that guided discovery is about being as hands off as possible and just kind of leaving the kids to kind of figure stuff out on their own, which is true to an extent. It's much more critical at the junior level, which I know a lot of your listeners are in. So it is something to be attuned to and aware of. Some people at that level misinterpret this though as well. Why do I need to be around then? This is literally just trial and error. Like, hey, just go out there and figure it out. It couldn't be further from the truth, right? Um, Guided discovery is think about the first word, guided. It's guided discovery. It's not random discovery. You are doing the guiding as a coach. The best coaches that I've seen or worked with are elite in this respect. They can basically shape a practice environment so that the feedback the kid is getting, the opportunity the kid is getting to develop his mechanics or strategy or whatever, are inherently available in the drill that they provide, as opposed to having to step in every 30 seconds. That was good, that was bad, change this, focus on this. That's where we start to get into this precarious situation. So it's definitely something to be aware of. Maybe as a really simple example that I think everyone has probably seen, something as simple as BP. I'm not going to give you feedback, but we're going to set up these screens, in and around 60 feet. And the objective is going to be to maybe hit the ball over the screens. That's it. Kid automatically gets feedback if that happens or it doesn't happen. There's no need to kind of step in and say, this is bad, this is good. And then they can self-reflect during that process of hitting batting practice. That one didn't work. Okay, why not? And you're kind of forcing them to figure things out, which is important in and of itself. When you get to the big leagues and you're in the World Series and it's a full count, runners on, you don't have, hey, hitting coach, what do you got over there? Like, you need to be able to figure things out. There's something to that. The tough part becomes, like I said, it's level dependent. As you get up levels, sometimes you don't have the luxury of being able to use that guided discovery method. Again, if we're talking about going into a World Series and you're facing Justin Verlander, unfortunately, you can't set up a practice scenario that's going to replicate, hey, this is what Justin Verlander does, this is kind of his tendencies, whatnot. you might need to have some explicit conversations about, hey, this is his strategy. These are the things that he struggles with. These are his strengths. So be cognizant of those. Um,
Hey, is
as
that
you,
that's where the VR piece is coming into play a little bit now too? Correct.
it is, yeah, it
I mean, it's
certainly
not the
is.
same, but I mean, you could strap the headset on and actually watch Verlander throw to you. I mean, that's the next piece of it.
It's the next piece of it. It's that notion of getting reps in situations where you otherwise couldn't get reps, and that's the perfect application of VR that we're now seeing in professional sport. So some of the wins that I think I've seen with VR is more honestly from guys who are transitioning from AAA to the big leagues, who maybe haven't seen that big league quality pitch yet, and they haven't faced this pitcher yet. So
And they
I
haven't
don't.
been in the stadium either. I mean, that goes back to the military piece. They haven't taken you get a rookie called up to Yankee Stadium for the first time. They haven't taken at bats in Yankee Stadium. So the perception is different. The amount of volume that they're going to hear from fans screaming is different. That goes into the specificity piece. Is how
Totally.
can you allow them to for their learning curve to shorten, because those are the things that are going to throw them out of whack a little bit too, because all of that stuff is brand new.
Totally. And I think you hit it on the head. Like, it really is about how you approach it. If you're approaching it more from those pieces, then absolutely there's value. The thing that you have to be careful with is VR, or with VR, is this notion of perception action coupling, right? Typically with VR, you're getting these perceptual elements, which are critical and you wouldn't otherwise be getting, but you're not always putting the action with that perception. And those two things feed off each other, right? Your mechanics are ultimately a product of what you perceive. You initiate your swing because you see where the ball is. You dictate where to swing because of the movement you're seeing in the ball, those things. So you're seeing this perception, but you're not coupling it with an actual swing.
It's getting
Um,
there though. I mean, they're starting to get there with being able to actually swing a bat with it. So it is getting there.
it's definitely getting there. There's also the haptic element of being able to feel vibrations off the bat, which is going to give you feedback. But like I said, if going back to that feedback piece I talked about, that third element is the notion of being as accurate as possible. Because here's the thing that not a lot of people think about with feedback. If you get feedback wrong, you can really easily regress an athlete. So if you have a VR system that is potentially not actually replicating precisely what Verlander's fastball does, they're going to get into a habit of, hey, perfect, this is what it looks like, and I'm going to be able to adapt my swing. They step into the box and it's like 4 inches off. That's a serious, serious problem that you've created because of your lack of attention to detail in practice. So it's just something, again, to be aware of with that.
Hey, what makes Dylan Lawson so great? I mean, I know why he's great, but in your eyes, what makes him so great?
First off, you used the word great. I don't recall saying that he's great, but I'm sure that he'll appreciate that, right? Now look, he's solid in the sense that uh, he's him and Sam Breen, actually, who's our pitching coordinator. They're two coaches who they were very interesting for me to interact with for the first time because they had a lot of a similar background to myself. It's kind of like a lot of the things that I'd typically bring to the table were already there with those guys, if that makes sense. So they were the first coaches that I could maybe have high level conversations with from the outset. And by the way, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily any better than the next coach. I think all coaches have different skill sets and bring different things to the table, whether it's relationship building or high level mechanics. Um, the thing that's, I guess, different about those guys is that we talk about feedback for athletes. They they necessitate that we provide feedback to them as coaches. What am I doing wrong? What can I be doing better? Does this drill work? Does this drill not work? Why does it not work? It's continuous self-reflection. It's continuous evolution to find higher ground. And, which is really important, there's situations whereby things might not be working and they're happy to be like, okay, we tried it. It didn't work. We're going to move on to something else. Even though this is something that maybe we trusted for 10 years, we looked at it objectively. It didn't seem to be working. Okay, now we need to adapt. It's a very
And that's the
different
science
process.
based background of all of it, and asking great questions. And that's the science piece. Is you may ask a question, you're going to test it. It doesn't work. It's okay to change your mind. It's okay to go do something else. Like, that's the science basis of it.
It's literally the scientific method, right?
Yep.
Obviously, those guys were exposed to that. They both have masters, so they're into those things. It's honestly all of our coaches. We were really fortunate, the Yankees, to have that. Um, Again, I don't think that necessarily being a scientist makes you a good coach, though. So it's not about that. I mean, I'd
Still have
say
to
that
be able
my
to
science.
communicate with people. You know, the best coaches are great communicators. They can take complex information, will it down, and get their athletes to understand it. And there's an art to all of it. Like you said, they know when to get out of the way. They know when to jump in and provide feedback. That's the art of coaching as well as the timing piece of all of it. They know what to say, when to say it, and that takes some time to learn that. But the best coaches are the best communicators. They can get players to understand what they're talking about.
I couldn't have said it better. It literally all comes down to impact. However, that is. Different coaches have impact in different ways. And however you can take information that I think is valuable and translate it to make it valuable for your player is all that matters. I can literally be the best skill acquisition practitioner on the planet. But if it never reaches you or never reaches the player, we're just wasting our time here. So finding that balance, as you know, it's not easy. It's about being open minded. It's about working with people. For those on my side, though, it's also about understanding that we don't have the answers either. This is literally 50-50. Like, you guys have been in baseball for 20, 30, 40 years. Those experiences are scientific experiments in themselves. You've seen what works, you've seen what doesn't work. And it's critical to find that balance. I think I've seen a lot of people, certainly in baseball, but other sports, in my position, come in and say, hey, this is how this works in literature. I can cite 7 research studies on this. This is how it needs to be done. And it never works. Those people typically don't last very long. So it's about finding, common ground, finding out what works, finding out what doesn't work, and realizing that, you got to be humble. You don't know everything. Simple as that.
Hey, if we're going to have a whiteboard, it was blank, and I put baseball team or baseball organization at the top and just gave you a clean slate, what would be the first thing that you would write underneath that if you were gonna start from scratch? What would be the most important thing that you would start with?
You're going to think, oh, like we just talked about this. So, like, that's why he's giving me this answer. But I've actually been on record in the media while not talking about the importance of this. Some people call them conduits. I call them translators. It literally is people who are able to take the the old school approach and the new school approach, put it together, and again, like I said, actually influence what happens on the field, which again is all that matters. There's unbelievable analysts out there that are Ivy League educated PhDs. There's guys who are Hall of Famers who couldn't care to look at a number. Both have value. I want the people in the middle, or at least the people on either side who are open to figuring out what the other side knows. And again, I think we're pretty fortunate in New York to be able to have those people in basically every um, capacity. But for me, that's all this comes down to, Ryan. Like, we're trying to talk about applying the scientific method to baseball to progress us. If you don't have those two things, you're basically spinning your wheels. Simple as that.
I had scouts yell at me like 15 years ago because I said, "Hey, you guys need to cut the minor league teams down." They're like, "Oh, that'll never happen." I'm like, I have some ideas, and this is why I'm probably not a GM but I changed the draft still. I think signing bonuses are too high. But I would pay minor league players more money, and I would pay them as 12-month salaried employees. And John and I have talked about this. I would force the minor leaguers to live in the complex in the off season, and they would have to be with the organization for 12 months. But you pay them as a 12-month employee. That's what I would switch. I think you would get a better return on player development because you have your thumb on them from a training standpoint, from a nutrition standpoint, from a sleep standpoint, and maybe somebody's like, "Well, you're being too regimented." I think if you pay them more money, it makes it a little more realistic for somebody to be around. Those would be the things that I would change. I would cut the signing bonuses back, but I would pay minor leaguers way more money. And, that's more of an NHL model. That's more of a club model. But I think if you give them the opportunity to just focus on being a baseball player for 12 months and some of your $1,000 signs, your $5,000 signs, they've got to work in the off season. Those would be the things that I would change. But again, that's why I'm not getting paid to do that.
No, I think honestly, more and more teams are moving toward that model. And I go back to other sports again. You're literally describing kind of what happens at Manchester City and Liverpool
Yes.
or Manchester United. Like, that they literally have facilities that are huge, that are owned with dorms. The players live there. They play once a week, but they're also getting schooled at the same time as they're kind of living there and developing. And there's this it's kind of like maybe an IMG kind of model. I don't disagree. And I don't disagree that it's actually going to happen. And like I said, I think it actually is happening, at least to some degree, more and more in baseball. So I'm certainly not going to turn away the opportunity to have more face time with athletes. I mean, I think we have the best coaches on the planet, so why would we not want to leverage that? It's kind of simple as that.
Yeah, I just wouldn't try, and not that there's some trust to it, but again, if they're going to be an employee and play for us, I would want to see them more. Think you get some disconnects. With any human relationship, the more you're around someone, the better relationship you're going to have. Now, it makes it harder to cut people too. I mean, that's part of it as well. It's harder to release somebody that maybe you're around them a little bit more, but that's part of the business side of it too. Is sometimes guys aren't good enough, so they're going to be asked to not be around anymore, and that's part of the professional side of it, the business side of it.
Yeah.
Hey, do you have a fail forward moment? Everybody has to answer this question. Do you have something that you thought was going to sidetrack you, but looking back now was one of the best things that happened to you?
Um, that one's tough. uh, I guess this is going to be a cop out answer, but I'm going to say that it works because my background is at least somewhat skill acquisition. The thing with skill ac, and we haven't really talked about this today, is that failure isn't only part of the process, but it's central to the process. It's necessary. It's actually something that you seek out. You want failures because you kind of figure out, well, this doesn't work. So in some ways, when you're like me and you've been indoctrinated in that fashion, it almost removes the stigma around failure, if that makes sense. I think Thomas Edison said it best, right? What was his famous quote? Like, I've never
10,000
failed.
tries.
Yeah,
It's great. It is great.
I've never failed. I just found, 1,000 ways that didn't work. Literally the perfect way to think about that. So I've probably failed more than most people, but really it's all about perspective, right? Like at the end of the day, I'm in a very fortunate position where I'm a director at the New York Yankees. Like if whatever has happened along the way that's been perceived as a failure has led me here, it's tough for me to sit here and say, hey, I'm in a somewhat of an envious position for a lot of people, but like, yeah, that was really bad. That sucked.
Everybody has those common. It, there's a path. There's a timeline to everything. There's a path to everything, and there's setbacks along that path to get to where you're at. But I look at all the things that I've screwed up in 47 years of life, but it's led me to this point. Like everything that I've screwed up, all the mistakes I've made, or some of the failures, and I don't view it as failure either. It's all part of the journey and the process. But I think sometimes we have so many people out there that just focus on when things go bad, just like the elite athletes, they flush it. I think the elite that we have in any profession are able to flush and get rid of it if something doesn't go their way. And really it's their perspective. Their perspective is elite on when things don't go their way.
Yeah, it is. It's all about perspective. Like I said, I can't recall something that was so profoundly bad in my career that I regret it or I wish it didn't happen. Not because it didn't happen, but likely because my perspective was like, yeah, it's kind of whatever at the time. It's there. I just can't cite it for that reason.
It's stoicism. I mean, there's a lot of stoicism to that thinking with the philosophy piece of that is being able to let things go. Hey, do you have any evening or morning routines that you do that you like, that you feel like help you energy wise?
For me, everything revolves around sleep. Again, it's easy to say for someone who's directed performance science. I can't sacrifice sleep, and I never have been able to, even going back to like my teenage years. So I work everything around that. Beyond that, honestly, like my role is kind of too varied to really control the day to day. So I kind of accept that, which I think is maybe the most critical part because it kind of keeps everything in context. But I'll just prioritize on the fly beyond that. So, it could be a free
Do you have a
agent.
set amount of hours? I mean, because your schedule, you just hit it, and I think that's the hard part is people that have a schedule like you, where I might be up late, I might not be up late. How do you adjust on the fly when you need to get enough sleep?
I will prioritize schedule travel around sleep to make sure that I can. Again, it's just the standard 8 hours. If I get 8 hours, I know that I'm going to be pretty solid. Like you said, the reality is I could have like a 20-minute deadline for a free agent eval that needs to be in. Ownership could be in town. I need to give a presentation. Like I can't control those things, so I'm not going to try. The reality is that Ryan, if Brian Cashman calls me right now and he's like, "Hey, I need to talk to you immediately," like I'm hanging up this call. There's nothing against you, but like that's just the reality of the job
And
that
I
I
would be
signed up
fine
for.
with it because again, there's priorities to everything, you know, and the job that you're in, like there's certain things that you do. It's just like being an assistant coach. When your head coach calls and wants something done, you need to do it. I don't care if it's dropping what you do, like you have to drop what you do and do it.
Totally. So there's two ways to look at that. You can kind of get frustrated and annoyed. "Oh, I don't have control or anything," or you can be like, look, I can't control these things, so I'm just going to prioritize them as they come in. I'm going to know they're going to happen. I'm going to be comfortable with that. I'm not going to get stressed about it. But if you can't deal with that kind of high pressure, dynamic work environment,
That's not a job for
baseball might
you.
not
That is not a
be.
job for you. And I
Yeah,
would talk about that all the time. Like there's certain things that come with certain jobs, and that's okay if you don't want to get on board with that. But you can't take that job and then complain about all the things that entail for you to do that job well. Like that's just not part of how it works. The elite ones don't do that. They take what they've been handed. They make great things out of it, and they just take all the other stuff as it comes, and they're able to get rid of it.
yeah. I feel like maybe the thing that served me best coming into baseball, you got to remember the schedule that you guys have is insanity
It's
for
insane.
someone who didn't come. It doesn't even make sense. That ability to go with the flow has maybe been the thing that served me best throughout my tenure at the Yankees. So far as routines go, everything's centered around sleep, and then beyond that, it's about being adaptable. Simple as that.
What are some final thoughts or things maybe we missed to fill gaps in?
I feel like we touched on a lot of different pieces. I don't know. I feel
Any
pretty comfortable.
resources out there, podcasts maybe that stuck out to you, books, if somebody wants to dive in on skill acquisition to start that maybe's not doing it, any nudges in the right direction, even if it's different sports. I mean,
That's the key for me. If you want to go into skill acquisition, there's definitely textbooks on that. There's the Dynamics of Skill Acquisition textbook, which is maybe the seminal publication on it from Keith Davids. Um, I personally, and I encourage everyone to do this, to look outside our sector for nuggets that you can bring back to baseball. Like I said, I think that's the biggest impact that I've had for the Yankees because I've tried to bring things in that like just weren't in their wheelhouse. Sometimes you get stuck into this tunnel vision approach in baseball. Um, I looked to the military a lot. I looked to the SEALs. Obviously, there's a lot of books on the things that I talked about, like those missions and the preparation and how they develop SEALs, those things. The other thing that I look to a lot is autobiographies of athletes. That's mainly because like I can get all the theory that I want from journal publications. That's simple. The things that I can't get is an insight into players' mind, and obviously that's arguably more critical or the most critical component of anything. So I can go to school for 1,000 years, but I'm not going to figure out what Michael Jordan was thinking, in Game 7 against Utah. Those are the pieces that really, shift the game for me. So that's what I look for.
David, I really appreciate it. Again, like I said, I was looking forward to this for 12 months, so I appreciate you coming on with me.
No, I really appreciate it. And look, thanks so much for the invite. Thanks for being patient. Congrats on what you've built here. I think what this podcast is doing for baseball, like you said, I mean, it's true. We listen to it at the Yankees. I think there's high school kids out there that listen to it. So you're really kind of spreading your wings across the whole game. And I think that's a testament to what you personally have done, but also your colleagues at the ABCA. So we really appreciate the work you're putting into it. And yeah, I couldn't be more grateful to be part of it. So I
Keep driving the
appreciate it.
game forward. Keep pushing it
Indeed.
forward. I appreciate everything you're doing.
Indeed. Thank you so much.